Welcome, everyone. Thank you again so much for joining us tonight. My name is Evan Traylor. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm a second-year rabbinic student at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in New York City. I'm also the rabbinic intern this year at the 92nd Street Y. And so on behalf of the Bronfman Center at the 92nd Street Y and our partners at the Jewish Federations of North America and the Forward, thank you for being here. Thank you, thank you. We're really excited for this session tonight with Ilana Kaufman. Just a quick word about the Bronfman Center for Jewish Life at the 92nd Street Y. Really creative, innovative center approaching Jewish life in a lot of new and exciting ways. And as part of my work over the last year and the work of the Bronfman Center over the last year has really been to ensure that the 92nd Street Y, just like we have expectations for our broader Jewish community, to ensure that we are connecting, engaging, empowering the true diversity that exists in our Jewish community. And so over the last year, we've been having programs focused towards Jews of color and creating new ways of building community, new ways of creating rituals and ways of connecting with one another. And we are really excited as part of this month, Black Jewish History, Black Jewish Futures Month, that we have Ilana Kaufman here with us. Ilana is the executive director of the Jews of Color Initiative, which is focused on grant making, research and field building, and community education for Jews of color. She has been featured in numerous outlets within the Jewish community, beyond the Jewish community, and truly is just a powerful and treasured leader for all of us. Ilana was previously the Public Affairs and Civic Engagement Director at the East Bay for the San Francisco Bay Area Jewish Community Relations Council. She is also a Schusterman Fellow. For our session today, I will turn it over to Ilana to share with us Beyond the Count, an incredible, powerful project from the Jews of Color Initiative. And so she will present and share this really rich information with us, push us in new ways, bring us together around some really exciting work for our entire Jewish community. And at the end of the session, we will have time for question and answer. If you have questions along the way, something really excites you, you have a question that you want to include as part of our time tonight, go ahead and put it in the chat. Both Ilana and I will be watching the chat and make sure that if there's a stopping point throughout the presentation that we get to your question. And if we don't get to it throughout the presentation, we will definitely have time at the end for any questions. But with that, Ilana, I will turn it over to you. Thank you again for being here tonight.
Oh, thank you so much, Rev. Evan. Thank you all for being here. Good evening to my East Coast colleagues as I stand here in Oakland, California. I'm going to put up my first slide. I'm going to get the slide deck set to the proper setting. I'm going to ask for Evan or Aria to give me a thumbs up if the screen looks the way it's supposed to. Is it still stuck on? I need to hang on for just a second.
Yep, take your time.
Let me try now. I need to detach the screen. All right, let's try this again. There we go. Yeah. There we go.
There we go.
Perfect. Okay. Good evening and welcome. I'm really happy to be here. Ilana Kaufman. I'm the executive director of the Jews of Color Initiative. And today I want to frame what we're doing as really in the spirit of teaching and learning. I'm going to present information to you. We're going to learn together. Like Evan said, let's ask and answer as many questions as we can. And we at the Jews of Color Initiative, part of our work is to listen to the questions of the entire Jewish community ecosystem in the United States and to answer those questions. And so we really bring this presentation to you in the spirit of sharing and in the spirit of us being in service to the conversation. We're literally here to deliver this kind of information to you and to help the community grapple with what it means to be a multiracial, ideally anti-racist Jewish community. For the first time ever, I've actually combined some slides from our first research study called Counting Inconsistencies with our new data from Beyond the Count. And I want to talk a little bit about why we commissioned these studies. We commissioned Counting Inconsistencies because when the Jews of Color Initiative began, every time we would go out and talk about Jews of color, it wouldn't matter if we were talking about compelling things, it wouldn't matter if we were talking about provocative facts. The only question we would ever get was, but how many Jews of color are there, really? And so there was always a question of inquiry, and it was always framed with some skepticism about the number of Jews of color in the United States. And so our first study from 2.5 years ago, 2 years ago, was to look at the demographic studies across the Jewish community in the United States and come up with an idea of how many Jews of color there are. And so we'll talk about that in just a second. And then 2 years later, as the community is doing work around racial injustice and becoming a more just Jewish community and really understanding what it means for us to be a community where we are multiracial, even if we don't see ourselves that way, and even if we don't project ourselves in that way, that's the reality. And so with that reality, we have to wonder what the experiences and beliefs and perspectives are of Jews of color. What's our experience out in the field? What's our experience in our organizations? What can we learn from our stories? And how can we make our community not only more welcoming, but really better? And so that's part of our work. I'm going to offer you some essential questions right now to guide your learning. I want you, when you're listening to the data, to ask yourselves, who am I in the data? Am I an organizational leader who might be responsible for holding some of what's happening inside of our organizations? Am I a community member who's experiencing these things as a Jew of color? Am I part of a multiracial family? And does my partner or my spouse or do my kids have these experiences that we're talking about today mirrored in their own life experiences? What can I do about it? Am I a person of power and influence? And can I help affect change? Let me talk a little bit about the study's methodologies. Counting Inconsistencies is a demographic meta-analysis about Jewish people of color in the United States. So that means we looked at something like 25 Jewish community studies and boiled down those studies to extract from them the data about how many Jews of color were counted in that data. And so we looked at other people's work and studied their work and came up with a number. With Beyond the Count, this is a totally different kind of study where we hired this robust research team. Both of our teams were housed out of Stanford and USC, just by the way, since I know some of you will be curious. But with Beyond the Count, we hired a research team of something like 6 or 7 researchers to do a survey. And so we have survey responses from more than 1,000 Jews of color in the United States. There were another 60 interviews that came after the surveys, plus another 13 interviews after that. And so while this is not a representative survey, technically it's called a snowball survey, where you cast the net, or to mix metaphors, and you have the ripples, and the ripples touch the ripples, and you get as many people as you can. Well, it's not a truly representative survey. You'll see in a minute, there's a map to show you from where all the survey data comes from. And we have a broad swath of data here, and it is the largest data set of Jews of color in US history. And so it's a powerful data set, even though it's not technically representative. I'm going to show you top line data in about 2 seconds, and then we're going to talk about strategic interventions together. Okay, so first of all, I know you're sitting there going, like, for some of you, what are we talking about when we're talking about Jews of color? So first of all, it's really important for me to say that at the Jews of Color Initiative, we do not have a definition of what it means to be a Jew of color. We operate under a conceptual framework, which is informed by US history, by understandings around critical race theory and the reality of systems and structures that are informed by racism and racist institutions. We acknowledge the outcomes and the impacts of racism in the United States, and we understand the impact of racism specifically on people who are not only self-identified, but who are identified as people of color. And so we start kind of a framework as informed by these categories that you see here: non-white Latinx, Latino, Latine, Black, African American, American Indian, Native, Asian, Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander, multiracial. And then for the Jews of Color Initiative in specific, we then ask ourselves, okay, where do our Sephardi and Mizrahi family fit in here? We go to our Sephardi and Mizrahi colleagues out there and we ask them, how do you self-identify in terms of being people of color or not? In doing a recent grant conversation with one of our partner organizations out there who's got a heavy representation of Persian Jews, for example. And in that group, many of them, not all, self-identify as Mizrahi, some. Of that group, 93% self-identify as Jews of color. Similar when we talk with our colleagues over at Jimena, Jews of Middle Eastern and North African ancestry, they tell us many Mizrahi in the United States self-identify as people of color, many Sephardi do not. And so we are comfortable with just kind of like this open definition in a relationship for our Sephardi and Mizrahi family. I also know some of you are thinking about Jews and whiteness, particularly in light of things like Pittsburgh, Colleyville, other horrible things that have happened to us as Jewish people in the United States. And the way I would talk about it just very briefly is historically, when some Eastern European and European Jews came to the United States, they were not classified as white. My mother's parents are from Poland and Romania, and when they came to the US, they were not identified as white, and they didn't even identify that way. But over the course of the generations, over the opportunities Jews of European descent have had to take hold of tools of upward mobility that were only offered to those in the US who were categorized as white. The GI Bill, for example, opportunities for fine housing and home loans, opportunities for fine college educations. Those opportunities were restricted to those categorized by the US government as white in the United States, and those opportunities were offered to Jews of European descent, and they took them. And over time, Jews of European background have assimilated into a context of whiteness in the United States. And that assimilation has come with some comfort, some passing, and moving through the United States with tremendous privilege and being able to kind of hide. And then there was 2016. There was the reality that white supremacists do not view European Jews the same way they view real white people. And so we have an understanding that for many white Jewish people, that kind of the privilege that comes with whiteness and the safety that comes with whiteness and the ability to pass is also conditional. And it can be conditional based on anti-Semitism, white supremacy, and white nationalism. And so it's like a dual identity of being both white and conditionally white depending on the context. But as my mother, who again, my grandparents are from Poland and Romania, would say, nobody knows how white you are until you have Black children. And then your ability to move through the world as white becomes very clear. And so that's our quick dash through how we think about Jews of color, racial identity, and the very importance of self-identification at the Jews of Color Initiative. Okay, so first let me give you some data about Jews of color in the United States in a very general way. The data tells us, and Pew has affirmed this with us in the 2020 Statement of Jewish Americans, that depending on the age cohort, something like 1 million Jews out of the 7 million Jews in the United States are people of color. And depending on the age cohort you're talking about, at the elder levels of our community, the numbers of people of color are like about 8%. And at the very young people levels, the numbers are somewhere between 15, 20%. And every single day in the United States, that number gets bigger. And so we're not having a theoretical conversation, right, about when the Jewish community will be multiracial, why we need to be anti-racist, why we need to take seriously the experiences and perspectives of Jews of color. If we don't have more leaders of color, we will have a community where Jewish children of color have no role models. If we don't have more people of color in our communal spaces, we will have to ask ourselves the uncomfortable questions as to why our community organizations are all white when our community is not. And if our community is divided by race in the United States, that's just not good for the Jewish people. 20% of our families in the United States self-identify as multiracial. If you're on the coast, that number becomes not 1 in 5, but 1 in 4. And so that means you might see the white family member at a synagogue, at a day school, wherever, but they're thinking about their family of color. Are we going to be safe here? Am I going to be racially profiled here? Will I have my opportunity to engage with Tara? The data will show us today 80% of the US Jewish community experienced discrimination inside of the Jewish community. That number should be shocking. Only 13% of Jews of color believe our communal leaders are doing an adequate job of responding to racism inside of the Jewish community. That number should be equally painful. And there's something like a fraction of a percent of Jewish communal leaders who are people of color. And I strongly believe, given our history of discrimination, our history of being marginalized, we should have intense discomfort with white leadership leading a community of color, with all white leadership leading a community of color. The optics of that are deeply uncomfortable. The practice of that is even more uncomfortable. All right, let's get into some data, more data. So we had 1,118 respondents and respond to the Beyond the Count survey. And we had feedback from all states except 3. As you can see, we also had 1 colleague respond from Puerto Rico, 4 from Hawaii, 2 from Alaska. This is available on our website. There's a lot of beautiful content in here, including narratives from the people who participated that are not going to be in today's slide deck. And so if you're interested in reading more of this data, please, please, please feel free to download it from the website. You can see a disproportionate number of respondents on the coasts, but you can also see folks in Utah, Colorado, Nebraska, South Dakota, Kansas, Oklahoma, Iowa. There are Jews of color everywhere. And in the way I want you to think about this is the Little Jews of Color initiative could find 1,118 Jews of color. Imagine what the Jewish Federations of North America could do, or the URJ could do. Right? The potential here is extraordinary. So let's talk about who responded. More than half of our respondents were in their 20s and 30s. Again, this is a snowball survey, so that tells you something about who's in our communal sphere. Clearly, more than half of the respondents self-identify as women. And I think it's really important to say 9% self-identified as non-binary, two-spirit, third gender, or another gender. So when we think about who's in our community, do we really know who's in our community? 14% of our respondents self-identify as disabled. And I think this number that I'm about to share is really, really potent. 80% of the respondents completed college. 49% have completed some or all of a postgraduate or professional degree. And what's funny is all 1,118 respondents responded to this particular question if you look at the end. So there's something very unique about this group of respondents being disproportionately, very highly formally educated. And what an incredible asset. Like when the Jewish community talks about a leadership pipeline being broken, and there's an absence of well-educated, well-trained, esteemed colleagues out there to fill leadership roles, I would argue that that's not true. And that maybe something like racism or racist headwinds or other kinds of experiences of marginalization are also in the way. So who was in this 1,118 respondent group? 21% self-identify as African-American, 11% as Latinx, 10% as Asian, 7% as Middle Eastern or North African, 1%, 12 respondents self-identified as white. And you could pick multiple identifiers in here. We had 6 respondents who are First Nation or Indigenous, 2 colleagues who self-identify as Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. And this is really, really important for us to hold as real. All of this is, right? 400 of the respondents self-identify as 2 or more races. So this is a trend of the United States. This is a trend of the Jewish community, and we have to pay careful attention. Another 98 self-identify as 3 or more races. And so just like the rest of the US community, the Jewish community is extremely diverse, mixed in multiple identities in ways that we can't imagine and can't fathom, which means our responses to racism have to not only be anti-racist, but they have to be expansive enough to not limit who we are talking about when we're talking about Jews of color and people of color. I know you're interested in ethnic background, which is not the same as race, as we all know. 42% of our respondents, 449, identify as Ashkenazi. So someone like me, where my mom is white, my father's Black. I was raised in a Jewish household. Another 9% self-identify as Sephardi, 4% is Mizrahi, 1% is Beta Israel. 21% self-identify as 2 or more ethnicities. This is very important. This is very important. Just as important as another 17% don't identify as any. And what does that mean when we have synagogues carved out by ethnic orientation? Programs carved out by ethnic orientation. On the slide, you also see how these respondents describe what being Jewish means to them. 85% said a culture, and you can pick more than one. 82% a people, 73% a religion, 48% an ethnicity. It's important to think about. So who was Jewish in these family structures? 49% of the respondents said that they were raised Jewish in their household. So this idea that Jews of color, everybody is a Jew by choice, is not true. This idea that everybody is adopted into Judaism is not true. 39% their mother or caregiver, 37% their father, 28% their spouse. 22% of Jews of color in this group have two parents who are Jewish. 42% have at least one parent who's Jewish. And so again, this idea, which is informed by, up until now, no data, the data tells us that Jews of color kind of are as traditional, and I'm going to put that in air quotes because it's a very provocative term, but are as traditionally Jewish as those who have backgrounds that are white. Okay, so let's talk about experiences and perspectives. This slide, if you're looking from the top down, is talking about different ways and pathways to Jewish engagement. Formal education, synagogue, overnight camp, JCCs, a Jews of color organization. 21% usually participate in formal education, another 18% in synagogue, another 11% in Jewish youth groups, another 8% in overnight camp, 5% usually travel to Israel. So the important thing, just aside from the really big numbers about usually, often, and sometimes, is that these are very traditional expressions of Jewish life, right? We're just talking about the regular old camps, JCCs, youth groups, synagogues, day schools. These participation rates are robust when you think about the numbers and Jews of color. This slide, what I want you to see and take away, the framing is the participants' Jewishness is most connected to a sense of justice and connection with the past and the future. And this is what they connect to is very important for the sense of Jewishness. And I want to point out the top 5 items. Working for justice and equality, passing on Jewish identity to the next generation, l'dor v'dor, honoring parents and grandparents and ancestors, remembering the Holocaust, celebrating the holidays. Not only are those, again, very traditional expressions of Jewish life connectedness, but these require training, right? You can't pass on Jewish identity to the next generation unless you know what you're passing on and you know how to pass it on. You don't remember the Holocaust unless you know about the Holocaust and you have the tools to remember the Holocaust. You don't celebrate Jewish holidays unless you have the skills and the training for tradition in that way, for Jewish ritual. So what these reveal is Jews of color are very well trained in Jewish life, in ritual life, and that's really important. This slide is talking about which expressions of Jewish identity feel less important. And these are the percentage of participants who indicated these particular expressions are not at all important. 18% of Jews of color say caring about Israel is not at all important. 12% say wearing Jewish symbols is not at all important. 12% say engaging in prayer is not important. And then you can read on. Every time I presented this slide, someone has asked me, how do these numbers compare to white Jewish people? And I'm just going to use shorthand and just say it that way. If you look at Pew, and these studies are not the same studies, but we had partners from Pew on our advisory board. I've spent time with Pew, and so we're very comfortable talking about our data. The number of not at all important for Pew is something like 23%. It's marginally higher than our data set. And I point that out because people always ask the question, because there's a slippery slope where people think people of color are somehow less affectionate about Israel, and that's not true. The data doesn't prove that out. But what we can see is a lot of people across different racial backgrounds in the Jewish community are in conflict about caring about Israel. It's not a white Jewish problem. It's not a Jews of color problem. It's a collective community problem. And it's shared across racial boundaries. Okay, we're going to talk about Jewish spaces, and we're going to keep it trucking. And again, if you have questions or curiosities, feel free to put it in the chat or ping Evan. What you're looking at in this slide is the following. The frame is, it's more difficult for identities to coexist in predominantly white Jewish spaces than BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color spaces. And again, dark green is usually, medium green is often, light green is sometimes. So 43% of Jews of color say usually or often. If you add the 33%, we're into the 70s, say it is hard to hold all of our various identities in coexistence when we are in predominantly white Jewish spaces. And so for those of you who lead, who hold, who have influence over white Jewish spaces, this is a very deep number to sit with. Okay? Again, another almost 70% have that same experience in predominantly BIPOC spaces that are not Jewish. And so we have this very unusual of being both people of color and Jewish and moving through spaces where we feel discomfort being whole a lot of the time, which is why our Jewish community should make these spaces even more welcoming for us. There's some, discomfort in having multiple identities in relationships with non-Jewish family members, but that number goes down. And kind of the most comfortable coexisting space is with relationships with Jewish family members. Again, 20 to 25% of these families are families that are multiracial. And so it gives you an idea of what's happening in these spaces. Okay, most Jews of color have had a wide range of negative experiences in Jewish communal settings. 75% have experienced others making assumptions about us based on our skin tone. 74% have felt burdened when we have to explain ourselves and our identities. 66% of us have been asked questions about our race and ethnicity that make us feel uncomfortable. 63% have experienced stress due to being the only member of our race in the communal space. And so just quickly do a replacement test, right? Pick a big room that you're in every day or every week or every month, and you be the only one of your gender or your sexual orientation or your racial identity or having a disability, or maybe being from or observant in a context that's highly not. But when you are the only one, it is an intensely stressful situation. 60% have felt tokenized, and 58% of us have made to feel like we don't belong. Most Jews of color, 80% have experienced discrimination in Jewish settings, kind of full stop. And that should make us, in a deep, deep way, wonder our roles in this, our experiencing this. The dark green is discrimination based on race, medium green is discrimination based on how we are Jewish, light green is discrimination because of another aspect of our identity. 54% of Jews of color have been discriminated in a spiritual community like a synagogue or a shul, more than half. 37% in a Jewish organization. So if you think about shuls and then all the other organizations, and then schools, 30%, other Jewish settings, 24%. Okay, these are very, very potent statistics. Let me tell you what you're looking at here. The theme is Jewish leaders of color, and to what extent Jewish leaders, and I'll put myself in the leader bucket, to what extent we are either adequately or inadequately addressing racism and white supremacy within the American Jewish community. 41% of Jews of color believe that specific needs of members of our community who are Jews of color are being inadequately responded to. 39% believe the leader response, 39% believe there's an inadequate leader response for the need for greater racial diversity in our Jewish organizational leadership. 35% of Jews of color believe our leaders are doing an inadequate job of responding to racism and white supremacy within the Jewish community. If you add that very poorly column, that goes up to 60%. If you add that fairly column, it goes up to almost 80%. And what's wild is the number improves when you're talking about Jewish leader response outside of the Jewish community, right? Like Jews of color know white Jewish leaders are doing a better job responding to racism outside of the Jewish community than inside the Jewish community. A couple more slides and I'm gonna turn it over to Evan. What you're looking at in this slide at the top is feeling most connected in the community. At the bottom is feeling least connected, okay? That's our theme, connection. Respondents reported feeling a greater sense of connection with other Jews of color than with white Jews. Respondents feel most connected when we're with our families. Our families are multiracial. Our families are Jewish. Our families look like the rest of the United States. We just feel safe and at home. Jews of color in the Jewish community feel connected but lesser connected when with a Jews of color organization. Connected but even lesser connected than with Jews of any race. The connection gets even more distant when we're talking about being with respondents of our racial ethnic community who are not Jewish. Even more distant when we're talking about just being in community with white Jewish people and organizational leaders, influencers out there. The level of disconnection is greatest when we're within predominantly white Jewish organizations. Okay. And so let's just talk about some strategies for intervention. It is imperative, whether you're an individual person out there just making your way in the world, moving as a Jewish communal member and participant, whether you're a communal leader. And I want you to think about interventions on the interpersonal level, on the institutional level inside of our organizations, and then clearly we have a systemic level problem. And so for those of us who have influence across that vertical, if you will, I want to invite you to also think about it on that level. So first and foremost, we have to support Jewish leaders of color. And it means we need to support Jewish leaders of color, like we learned earlier, being whole, authentic in our whole selves, doing what we do in our clearly learned, clearly engaged, clearly passionate about Jewish life way. And if Jewish leaders of color are as well equipped and informed as the data tells us, and also experiencing all the racism and discrimination the data tells us, but also are as engaged and passionate about Jewish life as the data tells us, what would it be like? Can you imagine Jewish leaders of color if we were not encumbered by racism in our community? Like if we weren't dealing with that, and all that energy, all that service, all that conflict, because this is not struggling for the sake of heaven. Okay, Jews of color enduring racism inside of the Jewish community is not us struggling for the sake of heaven together. It's us experiencing racism and discrimination. And if we didn't have to fight that, protect ourselves from that, endure that, and we could just focus on Jewish communal leadership, I want you to imagine how that asset might express itself. We need to support organizations and initiatives led by Jews of color, serving Jews of color. Clearly, at this time, organizations have been doing an inadequate job, and leadership has been doing an inadequate job. It will not always be like this. It doesn't always need to be like this. But in the meantime, Jewish leaders of color have a lot of perspective and a lot of passion for and a lot of vision for leadership. And we need to resource those colleagues and their organizations and their efforts so everybody in the Jewish community has somewhere to go to engage in Jewish life that's safe and affirming and lets them be whole. We need to shift organizational leadership to more accurately reflect the diversity of American Jews. And I appreciate that it's a kind of universal problem that leadership across kind of a capitalist community, and I'm not blaming capitalism, I'm identifying the United States, results in leadership being predominantly male and predominantly white. Like, I understand that as a historian, as social science, as a person of social science. Nevertheless, as Jews, as people who have the tools of being Jewish, of Jewish identity, of Jewish thought, of Jewish values, and as a people who have historically understood ourselves as multiracial and multi-ethnic, and this current sort of understanding ourselves as an invention of US racism, we have to do different and better because our community relies on being integrated and whole. We are just 2% of the US population. And so to allow ourselves to be split by racism jeopardizes the integrity, the strength of the US Jewish community. And if we don't have more diverse leadership, then we will not just have the breadth of ideas and perspectives and life experiences that we need to make really good and well-informed decisions, right? Like Harvard Business Review has waxed poetic, has gone on and on about the value of diverse leadership. And so we need to just use that data and apply it to our own community. We are not exceptional in this way. Clearly, we need to prioritize creating spaces and places for discourse and dialogue with Jews of color. And this is not like just think tanks. This is not like inviting Jews of color to your diversity committee. This is where we have strategic conversations with leaders who have strategic influence to inform how to affect the systems so that we have different outcomes out there. But if we continue to not having the real conversations, we will never interrupt the systems that are creating a paucity of leaders who are diverse and who are excited about leading in the Jewish community. If you look at just the clergy pipeline pathways as one example, over the next 10 years, something like 50% of our seats will stay vacant because the pipeline is empty. We know at the Jews of Color Initiative that there are scores and scores and scores of Jews of color clergy colleagues out there experiencing racism as a reason why they are having a hard time moving through the pipeline. And so we also can help our community be stronger by understanding what it means to have a pipeline that is unencumbered by racism and is accelerated by passion and commitment to Jewish life. We need to promote more research by and about Jews of color and Jewishness. What are the experiences of Jews who are both Jewish and Native American? How do they experience Jewish identity, Jewish spirituality? What are the experiences of a Latinx Jew who's a dreamer, who's modern Orthodox, and how they engage in Jewish life? What about the young woman I met with the last name Stein from Mongolia, who wants to participate in US Jewish life? If we don't know about the diversity of our people, we can't know about the diversity of what will help us not only engage, but be sustained. And then, as if this isn't obvious enough, and I'll end on this point, we must. The value proposition is clear: transform into an anti-racist community, anti-racist communal organizations. We can't expect Jews of color 80% of us to endure racism as an expectation for participating in Jewish life. We'd never expect that of women. We won't expect that of our LGBTQ community. We wouldn't expect that of ultra-Orthodox or other groups, our family from the former Soviet Union, Holocaust survivors. We would never allow our community to perpetuate in ways that literally pushed them out when all we want to do is be in. And so with that, Rev. Evan, I'm going to pass it back to you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen if that's okay. And thanks everybody for your attention.
Ilana, thank you. Thank you for, again, presenting us with so much information, data that's so key, but also I think framing this as what what do we want our community to be? This is who we are. This is what I pulled out from reading the report and from tonight. This is who we are. And so the question becomes, what kind of community do we want to be? What do we want to build? So I want to encourage people, if they have questions, you can either put them in the chat. Also down on the bottom of the Zoom box under reactions, there's a way to raise your hand. So you could either turn your video on and raise your hand, or there's a way to use Zoom to raise hand to ask questions, because we have a lot of time. And Ilana, if it's okay, I'd like to start with the question and then give people a chance to think and process a little bit more. So if you have questions, feel free to put in the chat or raise your hand in some way. But I guess just to start off, you've been sitting with this information, sharing it with people for a while now. I wonder if you could go back a little bit to the research process, or maybe right when you got some of the information. Was there anything that surprised you? Anything that like really stuck out of kind of, I like really was thinking this, but this, okay, here's the data. But yeah, anything that surprised you?
What a great question. So many things surprised me along the way. And so I love that question. First, we had the privilege of convening an extremely diverse group of Jews of color, for the most part, research team. And there were a couple of white colleagues on the team, but it was extremely racially diverse. It was diverse in terms of genders, sexual orientation, kind of the whole thing. And it was predominantly only one of the colleagues is not Jewish. And I don't know if any of you out there in the boxes are researchers or operate in a space where you're in a very formal and traditional research environment, deeply informed by the academy. But as social scientists, we've never been together before in a diverse group, and never as a Jewishly dominant diverse group of people. And so at the first research team meeting, we literally kind of all looked around the room, and just kind of like the energy that happens when you bring diverse groups of people together who haven't been brought together before is powerful. They also remarked that it was the first time in their professional careers that they had been invited to actually use their skills in the Jewish community. And so that's very, very deep, right? Like, you have people who are brilliant quantitative PhDs who are going to crunch all the numbers for me, and they could be doing this for any one of our organizations, for any one of our research houses out there, but nobody had bothered to ask. And so that was really surprising. I was equally surprised, and I'll just share this with the group. So we, as a Jews of Color Initiative, we decided to fund this on our own. We did not seek a foundation sponsor to finance this study. We raise our money for sure, but this came out of our general expenses. And so in doing that, we made the decision to have a very, very transparent and robust advisory group process, where we invited many funders into the group, the most brilliant researchers across the communal space to serve as an advisory group. And in that advisory group, again, and I don't want to belabor this, but I hope you can feel the sense of excitement that I'm exuding on the other side of your screen. But Jews of color and white Jewish people don't get to work together that often, kind of full stop. So all of you out there, like, how often do you get to go to like an accounting meeting, but just half the room happens to be filled with Jewish people of color, like for the synagogue audit committee or whatever. And so it's a very rare occasion, and mostly we're talking about diversity. And we're not talking about like core content. We're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're talking about diversity training. We're talking about kind of general themes. And so the opportunity to convene a diverse group of brilliant colleagues out there to be our advisory committee, including a bunch of our funders, and they'd never been convened in such a group before. They'd never been able to see the entire process of a research study in total transparency, from the first day to the last day, read the final draft before we hit send. And so it was an exceedingly transparent process, which reflects how we work at the initiative and what we needed it to be for the quality of the study for the community. A couple other things, if you don't mind, Evan. I was really surprised that we got over 1,000 respondents. And my team knows that I set that goal without asking anybody's permission. I did not inquire or even see if it was feasible. Yeah, I set it as a stretch goal. I'm a goal setting type of person. In an environment where most of our organizations will say, we know like 3 Jews of color, or maybe we know 12, depending on if you're in a major metropolitan, but like when you're in an environment where the narrative is that there's a paucity of us, that there's no way we're going to find each other. I've been on call after call with an audience that might be predominantly white, and someone will say like, well, we don't have any Jews of color in this state. And then the whole chat will fill up with, I'm a Jew of color, my kids are Jews of color, my partners are Jews of color. And so to actually have an opportunity to create physics where Jews of color can sort of say, here I am, Hineni, here I am, and let me share with you all of these perspectives to fill out your study. I was deeply moved by the scale of participation. I was shocked, to be honest with you, by the scale of participation. And I'll end by saying I was doing a teaching with the board chairs of the JCRCs about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And there was an African-American brother on the call, his little kippah tilted to the side. And he just like said, like, as we were warming up, I filled out your survey. And to meet people across the country who our survey found them, they found us, but they took the time. Like 1,118 Jewish people of color took the time to give us their experiences, both hard and wonderful. It was an incredibly powerful experience, and I think gives us a lot of sense of hope and perspective on like what's possible out there.
That's beautiful. And I also filled out the survey, and I will just say, and I think it's clear from the data that you presented, it was not I'm a Jew of color, press send and submit. It was it's thorough and took time. And so the fact that so many people, yes, took that time and really, said, Hineni, here I am in my full self, and here are all of my experiences. It really is great.
Right on. I want to I would encourage people, again, in the printed version, and maybe we could grab a link and drop it into the chat. But there are narratives in the study itself, the actual report. There's voices in there. There are people talking in there. There's quotes after quote after quote. And so like the numbers are powerful and potent, but like the voices in there are really beautiful. And so I just want to encourage you to curl up, with a bottle of seltzer or a glass of Chardonnay and, your favorite Beyond the Count version and read all of it.
Absolutely. I'll drop that in the chat right now. I'll pass it to Sabrina. Thank you for being here.
I have really enjoying this series, and I'm especially to see so many of my favorite people, some of whom I know and some of whom I don't know. And I absolutely adore you, Ilana, and all you're up to. I also answered the survey, and what I really loved about it was how thorough it was, and the things that I was asked that I never really thought about. Well, how do I feel about this? And as I've been talking to other people about it, they've been really excited. We've had many conversations in our area about different pieces of it, is part of what I want to say. And then I've also been having conversations with some of my white colleagues and the leadership in my area and across the country about it. And what they want, the first thing they say is it really that bad? And I say yes, unequivocally, without hesitation. And they just can't imagine that it's really that bad. And in terms of that, 80% of us have experienced racism within the community. And I said, yeah, I mean, that when I travel now, I call folks in advance or email folks in advance and say, where do you go? Can I meet up with you? Because I'm I'm not walking in someplace and having to defend myself in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
Even though I've changed how I even approach that, I just don't want to be bothered anymore.
Right. Thank you for all of that. I mean, and I would just say for everybody, like the 80% is just a blinding number. And it forces us to like have to hearken back to a time when 80% of Jews experienced verbal, overt, daily anti-Semitism. The kind that you're afraid to go somewhere, the kind where you feel like you're not going to be welcome, the kind that they feel like if they find out about you, they might treat you differently. And the way we think about it is like those are decades old experiences that we would never tolerate anymore. And so the other thing about this data, and I just appreciate you so much for bringing this up, Sabrina, is what makes race different than gender or sexual orientation? You know, like, what is it that we got this data? Like, every one of our community leaders has this data. Like, why did we not hear the communal breaks halt and go, oh my God, like we have a crisis on our hands? And so it also means that we have to, as individuals, be in deep touch with our relationship to race and racism as Jews. And the US has not done us any favors in terms of like giving us healthy mindsets related to race and racism. And so I want to acknowledge like every one of us on this screen has breathed the same racist air. And we all have, even like Ibram Kendi talks about his own experiences being a racist. And I will say to you, even in designing this study, as somebody who is half white, as somebody who was raised in the reform movement, as somebody whose mother is Jewish, and so I code all the right ways, it was so important to have minds broader and experiences broader than my own, helping to inform and design this study. Because I even come with my own biases based on the privileges I carry in this community. And so that's all been really important. Sabrina, thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you, Sabrina. And Ilana, we have a question someone put in the chat to me, and a question about, you mentioned this in the data a little bit, but there are a number of communities, organizations created by Jews of color for Jews of color. And the question in the chat took note of that there are starting to be more and more communities, and wondering about which is affinity space specifically for Jews of color, and is wondering about, as more of those organizations are created, what does the future kind of look like for white Jews participating in or kind of building multiracial space with more of these organizations created by Jews of color for Jews of color? So a little bit of taking some data, taking information that we're seeing now, and asking a little bit about the future of, is there a time when some of these affinity spaces will maybe go to multiracial spaces, or
I think it's a really interesting question. Let me start with a little anecdote, which is back when we were traveling 2 months ago in October, or 4 months ago in October, before Omicron, I was at the UJA Federation in New York in like October 20th, or in the like October 20s. And by way of context, the UJA Federation in New York has been doing work around racial justice and equity for quite some time. And they have think tanks and they have task forces, and they do a lot of support of a variety of programs. And I have observed, whomever asked this question, I have observed what once was kind of a separate effort where there was an affinity space just for Jews of color, and then kind of like the white-led organization over here. Let's fast forward 3 years, and I walked into the room at the UJA Federation New York, and half the room had Jews of color in it. And the groups that had been separate over the arc of the years, when we just put out the regular old kind of call for the data presentation, who showed up were everybody because they were coming together around an opportunity for like a shared experience. And that's what I asked them, like, how did you get here? Why did you get here? They're like, again, the opportunity, like in my strategic inventions, opportunities for Jews of color and white folks to get together to grapple, but not just about diversity, about content. There's a paucity of those opportunities to do real work together. And so to your question, I think that it's really important, and an identity development data tells us this. It's developmentally important and appropriate for sort of affinity spaces of all kinds. And there's nothing wrong with those. What happens is they become problematic when we create environments around them that actually create a physics of separation. And there's an absence of meaningful, powerful opportunity that is purposeful for coming together. And so what is the future? Well, if sort of white-led organizations that are experienced as racist, and I'm being careful how I'm saying this because I want us to stay in this conversation together, if those organizations don't soften those racist edges, and if those organizations don't, in the most loving way, interrogate the systems and structures that perpetuate racism inside of the organization, right? Like there are people, but then over time, we codify culture and call them policies and procedures. And they're intended to serve everybody, but if whom they're serving are diverse and who it was designed for are not, there's just a conflict there. And so until we have our organizations really do some kind of transformative work around becoming less racist and really being authentically embodying who we are as being multiracial, I think we can anticipate some distance between the organizations. And I'm not saying the people, right? Like if you invite people to something that's important to talk about, like everyone will show up. And so I just want to encourage all of us to, first of all, like, let's hold space for all those JOC-led organizations. Because when we say all of those, let me put that into a context. In 2016, there were 4 JOC-led organizations in the United States. Today, there are only 25. Okay, out of the thousands and thousands and thousands of Jewish nonprofits led by white people. And so it's not like we're talking about an astounding number. Okay, we're talking about like a nice factual growth, but like we're talking about like a teeny number. So let them go, let us thrive, let us do our thing. We're all inside the community ecosystem, right? Just being Jewish, doing Jewish, knitting together the Jewish people. And in the meantime, let's do our work to become less racist and more welcoming and creating real authentic belonging. And let's talk about not diversity initiatives, but let's talk about organizational development. Let's talk about curriculum for K-12 learning. Let's talk about the bylaws for our synagogues and how we can make them more inclusive. Let's do the real work in diverse communities instead of talking about diversity in diverse communities.
Yes, yeah, I'm seeing a distinction of that I've heard you say before and other Jews of color as well, that the phrase kind of goes diversity, equity, and inclusion, but if it just stops at diversity efforts, we're missing out real opportunities around creating some of those big shifts in our communities.
Yes, and I'll even push a little further since we all know that I will. If there's no justice attached to there, then we're also not completing kind of our cycle of repair, right? Justice helps hold us accountable. Justice creates equity in the vast history of inequity. And justice means we understand that at the cost of some, others have been elevated. And that dynamic is not good for the Jewish people. So we got to make that right. And when we make that right, that's justice. It also has to be held with a tremendous amount of care. Because we don't want to squash others to raise some. We want to raise all ships together. And that's really important.
Great. I want to pause and see if others have questions. Any questions about the data, about communities that you're thinking about? I want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to ask a question if they have one. Okay. Ilana, I'm going to ask you one final question to finish us up for the night. This has been So helpful. Again, I participated in the survey, read the report, and to see all this pulled together again is really helpful. At the beginning of our conversation tonight, you asked all of us to think about the roles that we play in our communities, whether that's board member, a parent, a grandparent, a supporter of some kind, a donor. You asked us to consider the roles. And so I'd like to ask everyone to go back to that, think about what roles you're playing in our broad Jewish community. And Ilana, I wonder if you could just give us some marching orders as we're thinking about our role. What are some of the pieces that you would say to go forth, knowing that this is not a 5-year, 10-year plan that I'm asking you to give us, but what do we need to go forth from this session with?
A few thoughts, please. First, it is external forces. It is the white supremacists and the white nationalists. It is people who are not about elevating and reinforcing and tightening the fabric of the Jewish people, who want us to believe that we can't fight anti-Semitism and racism at the same time. And so they create this false dichotomy and this false conflict to separate us. And that separation becomes particularly powerful when you think about these are families, right? Like if Jews of color and white Jews are forced to choose which battle we're fighting, we're choosing our family over each other. And that's like never been our history. That's not what we do as the Jewish people. And it's actually buying in to the same systems that are trying to oppress all of us. And so I want us to just, if we can, let go of some fear that fighting racism and fighting anti-Semitism are in conflict and in competition with each other. Because if we fight them together, we all win, we all survive, and our families' future are ensured. Right? Like fighting them together not only inscribes us, it inscribes the next generations, and that's our responsibility. So that's one thing. I'm totally aware that depending on where we were raised, our age and stage, how we self-identify in terms of race, how we self-identify in terms of class background, perhaps our religious denomination, I am totally aware that it is risky to fight racism. And it's risky to work to be an anti-racist. And one of the biggest risks, well, they're partnered risks, but there are two huge risks. One is that if you have benefited from marginalizing people of color, and I don't mean like you went out and did some sort of overt action to marginalize people of color. I mean, we come from family histories and legacies that are all fueled and lubricated by the marginalization of people of color in this country. Right, that's just real. And every one of our opportunities for ascending to anything has been at the cost of people of color in this country. Like the history is just so clear, right? Like who were in your college classrooms? Who were in your yeshiva? You know, who's been on your board with you and your synagogue? So I'm just I want to just deal in reality, right? I want to just be close with you all and just deal in reality. And so fighting racism is discomforting for people who are in positions of authority and power and affluence and esteem because they've benefited from racism. But the other thing about being an anti-racist, it means we center the experiences of people of color over the comfort of white people. Right? So you're in a meeting, you're at a thing, or you're seeing something happen and somebody is being racist. And we not only object internally, which is at the bare minimum an expectation. Not only do we object externally, but we make sure our objection centers the person of color's experience. and we don't really worry about how the white person feels. We are conscious as citizens and as humans in the same experience together. We're not trying to cause harm for people. But being an anti-racist means we choose in the moment to center the person of color who's in harm. And if you think about, I mean, even as a person of color, if we think about all of the times we didn't say something, we didn't do something, we didn't interrupt because we didn't want to make a fuss, right? Or like we didn't want to disrespect that person publicly. And we frame it like disrespect, like what's more disrespectful, right? But we don't want to disrespect that person publicly, or it's like not Jewish, right? To like say something out loud, like let's wait until we get home and have that private conversation. But the cost for you as somebody who has an opportunity to intervene, the cost of missing that opportunity is real. And the cost for the person of color means they feel more harm, we feel more harm. And the cost for the person who's doing the harm is that we take away from them the opportunity to, first of all, know we've harmed somebody. And as Jews, we need to know when we have an invitation to make repair. But we take away the opportunity for them to be seen as capable of growing and receiving feedback. And everyone needs to be elevated and honored as someone who can grow and learn and change. And we need to take the risks as people who have power, but we need to invite those who cause harm to take risks too, to make it right. And so I ask that of you. And the last thing I would ask is that if you are in a family context where you don't have people of color in your family, the data tells us you're something like a grandbaby or a niece or a nephew or a baby cousin away from becoming one of those families in our US Jewish community that's multiracial, right? Like if you look at the demography, and I love demography, so if anybody wants to talk about it, call me. But if you look at it, like this train has left the station, and it's just the natural physics of the United States. And like, if your family doesn't have like a multiracial profile, it means it's a matter of time, or you're in a pretty rarefied environment, which should also be curious to you. But if you're in a family who like doesn't yet see itself as part of a multiracial Jewish people, I just want to invite you in, right? And I want you to invite you to extend yourself. And whatever work we're doing together now is creating fertile ground for your grandbabies or your nieces or nephews that are coming. And for all of us, when we see ourselves this way, and when we move through our world in a way that we know who we are, we recognize each other out there, shalom, 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 good Shabbos, right? Not because you look a certain way, but because why not assume everyone's a Jew? Why do we assume no one's a Jew? Let's assume everybody's a Jew, right? And err on the side of inclusion. And when we do that, who's at our door, who we recognize as our own people just expands and it grows. It strengthens us as neighbors, it strengthens us as friends, and obviously it strengthens us as the Jewish people. And that's my ask.
Amen, amen. Thank you. Thank you, Ilana, for being here tonight. Those are some good words to end on. And thank you for sharing so much information and data and stories. And yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We are really grateful to be doing this series, Black Jewish History, Black Jewish Futures, in partnership with Jewish Federations of North America in the Forward. Our last session as part of this series is on Thursday this week, February 17th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. We will have Cantor David Fair be performing for us and in conversation. His session is titled Hallelujah, celebrating song and spirit in the Black and Jewish American experience. I've been working with him on the session, and he will have some incredible musicians, and it will be a fun session filled with music and good conversation as well. And yes, in the chat is the link, or you can go to 92ndstreety.org to sign up. Again, that's this Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And that will be our last session for Black Jewish History, Black Jewish Futures Month. Thank you again, Ilana. Thank you again, everyone, for being here. And good night, everybody.
Thank you, everybody, so much for being here. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Evan.
Yes, thank you. Take care, everybody.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.